Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the Midlife Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor, and today I'm joined by a co-host and a guest. I'd like to welcome Jean Judson from Latter Daily Digest and Barbara Jones-Brown from Signature Books.
Hello.
Thanks so much for hosting with me, Jean, and thanks for coming on the
Sure.
channel.
I'm honored to be here. Thanks for asking me.
And welcome everyone to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators to talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre and how good or bad American Primeval was in displaying it. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you.
So maybe we can start out with just a little bit of your background, Barbara, because I would love for people to know how you got to where you are right now. And then I think what we probably should do is just give a brief overview of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. For my viewers who are not Mormon or have never been Mormon, they will need to know what that is. And maybe each of us can talk about how we came to find out about the massacre, because it is sort of one of those secrets in Mormon history that not a lot of people want to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so just real quickly, Barbara Jones-Brown is the co-author of Vengeance is Mine, the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its Aftermath. And it is available from Oxford University Press, wherever you find books, right, Barbara? Is that true?
Yeah, you can find it anywhere online. Lots of local bookstores have it. You can request it at your library, local bookstore, and it's available in hardback, audiobook, and ebook. So whatever format you like. And I would say the audiobook is really amazing. The author that they hired, or excuse me, the actor they hired to read it does a fantastic job. He does all of the different voices. And I was really impressed with how good the audiobook turned out as well, if that's your thing.
I love that. And I love audiobooks. However, if you get the audiobook, you probably aren't going to get the beautiful pictures and maps and everything. It is rich with all kinds of visual information. So
that's right. We'll have a link in the description of our show.
Great.
For it.
Yeah. So,
give us a little background on you and your history.
Sure. So starting with my history, I can share how my history intertwines with the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I grew up all over the West. I went to Brigham Young University, where I received my undergraduate degree in journalism and English. So I always wanted to be a writer. That was my dream. And so it took me 50 years, but 50 something years, but finally I achieved that dream by publishing this first book. But I grew up, active in the LDS Church and had never heard of the Mountain Meadows Massacre until I was 22 years old. I was also a returned missionary for the LDS Church, graduated from seminary, graduated from BYU, and had never heard of it. And that's something that we are trying to change, is to make sure people are aware of it and that it's no longer a secret or a forbidden topic that, we just don't talk about. But we want to move past that by just sharing all the research we could find on it and putting it out there for the public so that people can learn about it. And I have found quite a difference. When I first started working on the Mountain Meadows project, that was in 2005. And at that time, people would say, well, what do you do? And I edited the first book in this series that was called Massacre at Mountain Meadows. And at that time, I said, I'm editing this book. And then they'd say, what was the Mountain Meadows Massacre? So most of the time I had to explain what it was. What I found now is when I say I co-authored a book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, it's rare that people haven't heard of it anymore. So I'm glad that that's changing. Megan, you mentioned you had never heard of it like me. So I'm glad that it's changing and more people do understand what happened.
And who were the authors of the book that you edited?
So the first book in the series, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, was written by Ron Walker, Richard Turley, and Glenn Leonard. And I was their content editor. I was kind of there to kind of bring the three voices of all of the writers together. So there's just one voice in this book. And it was while I was working on the book that I just developed this passion for history. I thought, this is amazing. I just started, like any good editor should do, I delved into the primary sources, was reading anything and everything I could about it. And I found I loved this process of learning about history. So
you're getting paid to do a graduate level history course in Mountain Meadows Massacre.
Yeah, it was wonderful. It was my job. And so when that first book came out in 2008, I decided I didn't want to just edit historians. I wanted to be a historian. So I went back to graduate school and earned a master's degree in American history from the University of Utah. But back to how I first heard about Mountain Meadows. I was, as I mentioned, BYU graduate, returned missionary for the LDS Church. And I was in my parents' home one day visiting. My dad loved art, Mormon books, Mormon history, American history. So he had all kinds of Americana and all kinds of things hanging on our walls and in his book collection. And one of the things he had hanging in our home was a picture of Harper's Weekly depiction of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And I'm going to show you that right now so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, is that sharing now? Whoops.
There we go. Let me just switch the layout so there we go.
Okay, so this book, or this print, was printed in 1877 in Harper's Weekly, and it was printed when the trials of John D. Lee were going on. John D. Lee was the only perpetrator ever caught and convicted and executed for the crime. And so this was the trial of the century in the 1870s. And so this fold-out large depiction of Mountain Meadows appeared in Harper's Weekly. And you can't see it, but off screen here to my left, I'm looking at this original photo that I inherited, that I now have, this image, I should say. But anyways, I looked at it, and I had seen it many times before. I observed the wagon company walking into the valley, Dusty Valley, and that's all I had ever noticed. But this day, I happened to look in the right bottom corner, and I looked closely, and I saw several, really racialized, inaccurate depictions of Native Americans as savages. But I saw this in this depiction, and they've got knives clenched between their teeth. They're holding clubs, and they're just looking ominously at this wagon train entering the valley. And I thought, what on earth is going on here? And then I looked at the bottom, and it said Mountain Meadows. And so my dad happened to be there, and I said, Dad, what's the Mountain Meadows? And he said, well, honey, about in 1857, a California-bound wagon train was massacred by a group of Mormons and local Indians. And I said, what? I was shocked, as many people are the first time they hear about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I felt like I'd taken a gut punch. It was just so shocking to me to hear that. And I said, why would they do that? And he says, well, supposedly these people were bragging that they had the gun that killed Joseph Smith, and supposedly they had poisoned a spring as they were passing through Utah for California. And I said, so? Like, how does that justify, a massacre? And he says, my dad said, we just don't know that much about it, honey. So at that time, I didn't know about Juanita Brooks. This was years and years ago. I didn't know that a historian named Juanita Brooks had published a book about it in 1950. But I just kind of put it on my shelf, and I was like, someday I want to learn how this could happen. And so in 2005, when Rick Turley, who was my co-author for Vengeance is Mine, and then the author I edited on the first book, he called me and asked me to interview for a position in the church history department, where they were researching and preparing this book for publication. And I had just learned I was pregnant with our second child. And so I was like, timing's not great. So I said, I'm not interested in a full-time position. I said, but what would it be? And he said, I want you to edit my book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. And I said, I'll be right in for an interview. So I went in for the interview. It didn't make sense for us at that time in our lives, but I went in for the interview and just felt, no, I'm supposed to do this. I'm supposed to do this. And so I took the full-time job with a baby on the way, had the baby, took 3 months off, went right back to work. And long story short, we published this in 2008. So that's how I first learned about it. And what I was learning as I worked there and delving into these primary sources was horrifying. You get somewhat of the sense of that in what we wrote and what, all the sources we included, to the point I had PTSD-like symptoms. I would be sobbing every day driving home from work after working on this, nightmares. I would hyperventilate once I was running with my two girls, my little girls then at the time, to catch a bus, and I started panicking and hyperventilating because I knew that's how these immigrant women, they were running with their children, running for their lives with their children and just all kinds of episodes like that. It was rough. It was really rough to do these books.
I think that is something that a lot of people probably don't think about, is that the people who research these tragedies and who delve into these things, it really becomes, especially for those of us who are empathic in any way,
yes,
it becomes so real that I've never thought of it before until you mentioned this when I heard you speak at Thrive about these PTSD-like symptoms, that when you're really delving into the lives of these people and it becomes so real to you, I just have never considered that before. And what an incredible dedication it takes to really tell these stories in a real way.
Thank you for saying that, Megan. It means a lot to me. And what drove me on, because literally 40 hours a week, just reading about this horrific massacre of men, women, and children was tough. But what drove me on to keep going and then to agree to work on the second book as well was these people never got justice. Only one person was brought to justice. And because of that, I'm like, okay, well, the true story wasn't told at the time, but I'm going to make sure this story is out there. Their stories are recorded. These victims are never forgotten. And I'm telling the truth about what happened to people. And so I was doing it for the victims.
Yeah. And thank you for pointing that out, because I've been asked so many times in my own research as well, why do you keep digging into these tragedies and why do you keep talking about these stories over and over? And I think it's so important to point out that the victims' experiences matter and that their names need to be said. And especially in those cases when they don't receive justice or they don't receive full justice, it really is up to those of us who are left to tell their stories.
Right.
And the stories matter. And I'm so grateful that you have done it and that you are doing it.
Likewise to you, Megan. And I know you've delved into, your own extended family's history with the Lori Vallow Daybell, murders of her children.
Yeah.
And I'll say also that as a reader, you can pick a character to identify with and follow that character in the literature. But when you're writing, you have to be all the characters.
Yeah, that's right. If you're a good historian, a good historian who's trained in the craft, and the best way to share history is you try and get into the minds of all of the characters, even the characters you don't like, even the characters that did bad things, because you just want to show how they saw the world and what could drive another human being to mass murder other human beings. You have to try and get inside their minds and their mindset and share their side of the story too.
Yeah. So. I love that. Well, Jean, I don't know about you, but for me growing up, I remember hearing Mountain Meadows mentioned a couple of times. And I remember asking my dad, because he was the one who is a little more versed in the history of the church. I remember asking him, what it was, and he gave me a very dismissive answer. It was something like, this was a tragedy in our history. It's something that we're not proud of, and it's not something that you need to worry about. And I was a teenager at the time. I must have been probably either 14 or 15 at the time.
This is interesting, Megan. Sorry. We were probably at about the same time, because I'm several years older than you. It was probably
okay.
the same time we're both asking our dads about what happened. Isn't that something?
Wow. Yeah, that's amazing. I did not put that together, but that is amazing. Thank you for saying that. But yeah, it was the kind of thing where in the faithful Mormon part of my brain, my dad told me that I didn't need to look into it. And so therefore I never did. But there was also a part of me that said, if this is a troubling part of our history and people were harmed, which it sounds like it was a massacre, right? I felt the same way about that as I felt about some of the indigenous peoples' massacres. I thought, yes, it's horrible and it's hard to look at, but I feel like I want to know. And, like you, I was not a professional historian, nor am I now, but I did take a significant number of history classes in college because American history has always been fascinating, history in general, because it's just all history is to me is the stories of real people. And that is what is compelling to me. So when I came to Texas and I had to get a teaching certificate, I was, going to teach choir because my bachelor's and master's degrees are in singing, vocal performance, fine arts, and marketing. And my principal at the time, knowing how volatile the budget was for fine arts, he said, I want you to get certified in a secondary area just in case we have to give you a part-time case or class load, part-time in music and part-time in something else. He said, is there anything else in your college transcript that you're highly qualified to teach? And it just required a certain number of hours of college credits. And I said, yes, I'm highly qualified in history. So I studied for the Texas history exam and got certified in the state of Texas to teach history. I'm sad that I never got to, but I absolutely loved studying for it and passing that exam. It was like I had like 6 weeks to get ready for it, and I just did crash course and did it. And I had to learn a lot of Texas history that I hadn't known previously. So
you could remember the Alamo.
I could, yes, I did remember the Alamo on the test. But yeah, I was certified to teach history in the state of Texas. And so
cool. I love that.
So we have some similarities in our story.
Absolutely. Yeah. We have a lot in common.
Yeah. So for me, similarly, and I would like to contrast what little we know about the Mountain Meadows Massacre with the Hans Mills Massacre. Every 4 years, we learned about that, and we might spend a whole lesson on it. And that was 17 Mormons died in that event. And yet here we have, 140?
No, it's about 100.
But they weren't
in the Mountain Meadows.
Members. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the reason, Jean, is because in the Hans Mill Massacre, the Mormons were
killed,
the victims and not the perpetrators.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't until Institute probably that we learned more. And that was maybe the first time I had heard that it wasn't just the Indians. There might have been like, well, the Indians did it, but the Mormons looked on or maybe helped a little bit or something. But it wasn't maybe until 10 years ago that I actually heard that it was the LDS members were the major perpetrators of it.
10 years ago. So you didn't hear of Massacre at Mountain Meadows, I guess, then, because that was 2008.
No, I didn't. I wasn't purchasing books back then.
Yeah, no, that's no criticism. I'm just saying, that's really interesting that, it took that long after that first book came out
and for me, it was even longer because, following the counsel of church leaders and my parents, I did not look into anything that was not on the official LDS website or in the official correlated curriculum materials. I was a gospel doctrine teacher for about 6 years. I was a Relief Society teacher for at least 6 years and never looked into anything about Mountain Meadows. And so it wasn't until I started investigating truth claims in December of 2022 that I really started looking at anything that wasn't on the LDS website. And so I didn't find out until January of 2023 about Mountain Meadows. And the first thing that I came across was the Mormon Stories episode with John Larson, where he talked about the Willie and Martin handcart companies and just briefly mentioned Mountain Meadows. And I was like, oh yes, this is another thing I need to know about. So it's really just been within the last 2 years that I have understood the history of it. And then it wasn't until your episode on Mormon Stories, Barbara, where I really heard finally for the first time the real
A
story.
deep dive. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, that's something that we're hoping to change. And I do know that Mountain Meadows is taught in seminary now. It's part of the seminary curriculum.
That's good to hear.
In Utah history. It's part of the curriculum for Utah history students. So fourth graders and I think it's fourth and ninth graders learn about it as well when they're studying Utah history. Yeah, just
state history is usually middle school, so it'd probably be fourth graders and seventh graders, I think. But I mean, but that's Texas. It could be different in Utah for sure.
Yeah. So anyways, we're just trying to, it's been over 160 years since it happened. It's like we can talk about this, and we're just trying to make it not a taboo subject anymore. And we don't have to be afraid of talking about it. It's horrific, it's awful, but none of us today are responsible for it. The only thing we're responsible for today is how we engage with it. So we're responsible to learn about it. We're responsible
I agree.
to learn about it so that we can, as Utahns, as Americans, as Mormons, whoever, we can all just be sorry that it happened. Apologize. If you ever meet a descendant of a victim, even if your ancestors weren't there, you could still say, I'm so sorry that happened. That was wrong. And that means so much to people. And then we can all learn from it. We can learn what happens when there's a deep feeling of us and them and conflict, and how things can explode and lead to a tragedy like the Mountain Meadows Massacre.
That's right. Part of learning history is to be able to then not repeat it.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
And learn lessons. So
yeah. So I heard you speak at the Thrive conference, and we're going to talk about your comments there comparing American Primeval to the real history. I want to talk about the real history first.
Sure.
Before we do that, I would love to share just a very quick video that I took when I visited Mountain Meadows after the Thrive conference. We were there together, and the three of us in different places, right? But I just took a video of panning across the valley. I think it would be really great for our viewers and listeners to be able to see what this place looks like. I was incredibly struck by how beautiful that place is. I had always thought of it as sort of like a deserty, scrub brushy kind of thing. And it really is, it's kind of like high desert, I guess, but the colors were so gorgeous.
Yeah.
And it was just such a beautiful place. I can understand why it was the typical stopping point and the typical campground for wagon trains coming through that area, right?
Yes, absolutely. And real quick before you show it, I'm so glad you're going to show this, but just a minute, you're showing it in March when it actually is kind of bleak compared to how it looks in the summer. The summer is so beautiful. It's green and just a really, really lovely spot. And all of the historical sources, when they described the Mountain Meadows, described it as a beautiful spot with green, undulating grasses. And it was just a great place to stop and then just rest and let your animals feed in preparation for entering the long desert between that point and Las Vegas, which was there in 57, and then Southern California. So.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. So this is the 1st of March that we were here. So it was still pretty cold. It was extremely windy the day that we were there. There was still a little bit of snow up on the side of the hill. So I want to make sure that I put us in the right view here. Let me add this one. Okay, so I'm going to just remove this from the stage, but we'll be able to get to it again. I'll add this one. There we go. So I hope people can see it if you can't see it very well. So I'm bad with directions. So this is looking out from the monument at the top of the hill, and I'm panning this way across the meadow. So can you give us direction? Am I panning from
sort of north?
Yes, you are standing. This is a view from Dansill Hill, and it's a hill overlooking the entire valley. And there is a monument up there, and then there's a monument at the spot where the siege occurred and where there's a mass grave. So you're up above here, and you're looking north.
We're looking north, and we're going to pan over. And when I get to the end of the pan, that's where the actual massacre took place and where the monument is.
Actually, this is where the massacre took place.
Oh, really? Okay, so the monument's on the opposite side of the
So
valley?
the monument is where the siege site took place.
Okay.
This is where the massacre, they walked the victims up. You can see that kind of ridge. If you look at the right, the far right
Okay.
of this picture, this video, you see a ridge kind of gradually sloping down.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, keep going a little bit further, Megan, keep going with your
This way?
left, keep going left,
Oh, this way.
keep going,
So
keep going, yeah, keep going, right there, back to the
okay.
right, back to the right.
Okay.
Right
So right
about
here.
there where this ridge ends is
Okay.
where the women and children were murdered, and then the
Mhm.
men who were marching behind them were about a quarter mile back from there.
This way. Okay. All right. So this just is gonna slowly pan across.
Yeah, so try to imagine now in the summer that this is very green and pretty.
I mean, it was so beautiful at the time anyway, but yeah, it is, I guess it is a little browner than it would have been in the summer.
Yeah.
What a good camera operator you are, Megan.
Yeah.
Well, thanks.
Job. And then, yeah, if you kept going left a little bit further, you would see the siege site below, but
Yeah.
yeah.
It's just beautiful and just such a tragic story.
Yeah.
So that's all. I just wanted people to be able to have a visual of what the actual place looked like.
That's great. I'm so glad you shared that. Okay, yes. All right. So we'll just talk about in 1857. This is Brigham Young in 1855. This is the closest. Am I sharing it?
Yep.
Yes, looks good.
We can see it.
The closest picture to the time that we could identify. So it's about 1855. And the massacre happened on September 11th, 1857. So the Latter-day Saints came into the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, and they were fleeing the United States after being violently driven from Missouri and then Illinois in the 1830s and 1840s. So they come out to Utah. It wasn't Utah yet. It was Salt Lake Valley, just trying to escape, just live in isolation by themselves, away from everybody else, so that they could practice their religion in peace. But in the meantime, they are growing a theocracy in the West. Brigham Young was not only the president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he was also the governor of the territory of Utah. It became a territory in 1851. And so, no separation of church and state, if you will. And so non-Mormons who lived in the Salt Lake Valley started to get worried about the amount of control and power that Brigham Young and other church leaders had in again, creating a theocracy as opposed to a democracy. So some of these non-Mormon officials who had been federally appointed to live in Utah and work in Utah, they go back to Washington, D.C., and they warned the new incoming president named James Buchanan that about this growing theocracy, and that saying that Brigham Young has too much power, you need to replace him as governor with someone else, and also send a contingent of Army troops, U.S. Army troops, with these new federal officials to ensure that the Mormons accept the new governor and accept federal rule in Utah. So the Latter-day Saints, they learned that armies are on their way, and they have no word from the president why he's sending an army. And so based on their experience of the last 20 years, they are concerned, and they decide they're going to oppose these approaching troops. Young says, we will let the new governor in, but the troops must not enter. So they come up with strategies to try and keep the troops from approaching and try to convince Washington, D.C. and Congress to provide a check and a balance on the president of the United States and to pull the troops back. So here's some strategies they come up with. One is, this is a map of the territories at the time. The troops are on their way along this dotted line, the Oregon-California Trail into Salt Lake City. And so they decide they're going to stop the troops from entering into the settlements by burning the grass ahead of the troops' animals. So if the troops' animals can't eat, they can't pull their wagons. So they burn the grass and they literally kill hundreds of animals. They also burn the supply wagons of the U.S. Army and just do everything they can to keep the Army from approaching. Brigham Young says, don't kill anyone. We don't want to shed a drop of blood because we want to win this war, if you will, in the court of public opinion. So no one is killed in these endeavors, but it successfully works. The troops are not able to make it into Salt Lake City. Instead, they stop and build what's called Camp Scott outside the burned out remains of Fort Bridger. This is important when we talk about American Primeval series. Fort Bridger, the Latter-day Saints purchased it in 1855 and then burned it down in advance of the troops approach because it's a way station, a supply station, and they don't want the troops to have any kind of refuge or supply at Fort Bridger. And so they just burn the whole thing down.
That's so crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean, they owned it. They had the right to do it, but it's part of this war strategy, to keep the troops out.
Right.
So,
yeah.
Anyway,
I guess what is, I don't know, I guess what strikes me about, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
I guess what strikes me about this part of the story is that, so the Mormon people had fled the country. They've gone to the Utah Territory, and they're coming to this with sort of a legacy of persecution where they were driven out of their homes, countless times, and then their prophet was killed. And so they're coming to it with this huge persecution complex, if you will.
Yes.
And
Absolutely.
so when they finally get to Utah and they've suffered and starved and sacrificed, and so many people died on the Mormon Trail. And once they get there, they think they're finally going to have peace.
Yes.
And now they're being told that the American government, who they were trying to flee from because of Governor Boggs' extermination order in Missouri, the American government is now trying to send troops into their peaceful land that they think that they have earned the right to have this religious freedom.
Exactly.
So understanding that mindset, I think, is really important, because some people will look at this and they will say, Brigham Young was just a tyrant. He was a terrible person, which we could argue his character in other areas, right? But just at least understanding that part of his mindset and the people's mindset as well, that they really believe that they've been persecuted so much, and now they're looking at the possibility of having their religious freedom taken away again.
That's exactly right. And I can tell you've got all that training in history there, Megan, because you're right. Like, even though, like, you don't want to say, oh, well, these people are bad, therefore they did this, and these people are good, therefore. It's just like, no, these are just people, these are humans, and what would motivate them to do something like this? And you have to look at the background. Again, not to
and another wrench.
There is no justification for the Mountain Meadows
Massacre. Right. But another wrench into the story is that they were building Zion, and Jesus was going to be imminently coming, and they were going to do whatever it takes to do that. As a mindset.
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to protect their Zion in what became, Utah, and they did not want troops to occupy their settlements. And again, if you consider that troops, militiamen in Missouri and Illinois had violently driven them from those two states, of course they're afraid of these approaching troops.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Jean, to add to the mentality as well of the people, is that not only were they persecuted, but they also believed that they were God's chosen people and that Jesus Christ was imminently coming, and that they were supposed to be preparing the land and the people for the return of Jesus Christ. So they really believed in the cause of what they were trying to do.
Absolutely. Yep, absolutely. They believed that they'd been called to build Zion in preparation for the second coming of Jesus Christ.
In a way,
they believed that was more important than anything else.
Almost as a prelude to next 9/11 that would happen as a religiously motivated sort of disaster and tragedy, that happened in America on
Sure.
9/11, 2001.
Absolutely. And I think there's like religious factors, that of course shaped the Latter-day Saints view of things. And this was also very political. This was a highly political conflict.
I agree. And this is
local government and federal government. And we talk about what lessons we can learn today. This is one, just like the dangers, like what can happen when you've got local government in conflict with federal government, when, there can be these clashes that.
yes, and to me, it's a cautionary tale of theocracy, because what can happen when your religious motivations become political motivations and vice versa? It gets all tangled up and confused.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
this is why the separation of church and state is so important.
So important. That's right. Yeah. So, okay. So back to the map now. So that's one strategy that Young and his advisors come up with. Sorry. The other strategy is they want to make sure that the local Native Americans in Utah Territory, in their area, side with the Latter-day Saint settlers and not with the approaching troops. And so they're meeting with them. They're saying, hey, we need you to fight with us. You fight with us to help protect us, and we'll help protect you. Because if the troops come in here, they would like to kill us just as soon as they'd like to kill you. So they're trying to build those alliances. And then they're also they also came up with a strategy to use Native Americans to help them in a strategy to encourage Washington, D.C. to pull the troops back out of Utah. Young starts preaching. I'll go back to a picture of Young again. He's preaching that if the troops come into Utah Territory, then he and the Latter-day Saints will keep those trails that pass through the territory. They will no longer keep those trails safe for emigration. So if you look at the dotted lines here, and the one that's in deep black is the trail that the immigrants from Arkansas took to come, and where their trail ended at the Mountain Meadows. But you can see all of these trails from the eastern United States to the west, to California, which is the newest state in the nation, and to what was then Oregon Territory. They all pass through Utah Territory.
Mm-hmm.
And so Young and his advisors think that's the best leverage we have with Washington, D.C., is saying, hey, we're here, we're keeping all these trails safe for emigration. But if you send troops here, Young says, I will no longer say to the Indians, I will no longer hold them back, but I will say to them, do as you please, and they will start raiding cattle.
So he's offering a protection racket.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And this was interesting to me to learn for the first time too, because I don't think that that Brigham Young actually had control over the Indians, but he wanted people to believe that. Is that correct?
Yes, that's exactly right, Megan. He didn't actually, they were all their own sovereign tribes, right? But the Latter-day Saints had been forming relationships and alliances with Native Americans. Again, that goes back to their theology, their beliefs that Native Americans are of the house of Israel, and Latter-day Saints have an obligation to share the gospel with them.
Right. So for my audience who doesn't necessarily know Mormon history, originally the Book of Mormon noted that what Mormons believed is that the Native Americans in what is now the United States, that they descended from the Israelites. And so the Book of Mormon is the story of these people from Jerusalem who came across the ocean and landed here in the Americas. And so the Book of Mormon is supposed to be the story of those people. And the introduction of the Book of Mormon used to say that the Native Americans in the United States were descended from these people from Jerusalem. Now they've changed that later because the DNA obviously doesn't match up for that to be the truth. But back then, Mormons believed that Native Americans were the Lamanites from the Book of Mormon.
And I was saying, most Mormons still believe that.
Yeah, most Mormons still do believe that. That's true.
Including some descendants. Yeah.
Yeah, because they don't accept the DNA evidence. They say maybe there are things we just don't know yet, but they believe that Native Americans are descended from the Lamanites and the Nephites from the Book of Mormon, and that Mormons have an obligation to teach them the gospel. And at this time, Brigham Young was sending missionaries out to these different Native tribes and telling the men to marry Indian women, Native American women, and telling them to, try to tame their savage ways. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but it's all very problematic.
Yeah, it's very racist, definitely.
Very
It's
racist.
very paternalistic racism.
Right.
Yeah. So anyways, they're forming, they had these friendships beforehand anyway, because like you said, Megan, that's exactly right. Brigham Young was sending missionaries throughout the territory to teach the gospel to Native Americans, to teach Mormonism to Native Americans. But when this happens, they like step up their efforts to strengthen those alliances. And so while publicly Brigham Young is saying, and I should point out, Brigham Young was also the superintendent of Indian Affairs for Utah Territory, which is a federally appointed position. And his job was to keep these trails safe.
With a paycheck.
Yeah, that was part of his job as well.
So he was governor of the state. He was president of the Mormon Church, and he was head of Indian Affairs.
Yeah,
which is a federal appointee.
Exactly. No separation of powers, right?
Right.
So anyway, so they were making efforts to settle conflicts and skirmishes between passing immigrants and local Native tribes. And there were frequent skirmishes by giving them presents and food and trying to ameliorate, any conflicts that came up.
Mm-hmm.
So, but Young says, I'm not going to do that anymore now that the troops are on their way. And so he says, immigration must stop. If you're going to send troops here, then people can't pass through on these trails to the west anymore. Immigration must stop. And when I say emigration, it's spelled Emigration. Emigration, as opposed to immigration, is just when you're crossing a country, crossing a continent. So these immigrants, he says, must not pass through Utah anymore. Then privately, we found firsthand accounts with one of his interpreters named Dimmick Huntington. Yeah, so this is Brigham Young's interpreter, Dimmick Huntington, and I think it's interesting they're dressed almost identically in the photos. That's a Masonic pin that they're both wearing, and then they have the kind of same cravat, necktie. Anyways, so Brigham Young is, through his interpreter, Dimmick Huntington, he's meeting with all of these various tribes and encouraging them to raid the cattle companies on the routes north out of Salt Lake City. Here's a map again. So you can see there's a route that came into Salt Lake City, and then you could head north out of Salt Lake City and make it to Central California, or you could head south out of Salt Lake City and go to Southern California. So anyone who's familiar with Utah, this is basically I-15 today.
Mm-hmm.
And he's just encouraging all these tribes to raid cattle along this route. And so you can see on this map, between September 7th and October 3rd, 1857, multiple raids on multiple wagon trains at multiple locations throughout Utah Territory take place in that 3-week period. And on this map, you can see those that are marked by like a star, or an explosion. That's where these raids took place.
Okay. I just want to reiterate. I want to pause and reiterate, because this was, to me, it was critical to my understanding, to note that this is really what led to the massacre, is Brigham Young's order for the native people, which it was the Utes and the Paiutes. Is that right?
So it was the people that participated in these attacks were Shoshone.
Okay.
Pavant Utes. They're a band that's kind of like half Ute and half Paiute. But
okay.
Pavant is what they were called at the time, near central Utah, and then the southern Paiute.
Okay. So this order from Brigham Young for these particular bands and tribes to raid the cattle of passing immigrants, basically because cattle was wealth, right? So taking away their resources, whatever provisions they could, taking the cattle for the benefit of the Mormon people, right?
Yeah, it actually that wasn't true. The main sure they got that booty, right?
Right.
But the main motivation is just to say, look, if the troops come, all hell's going to break loose, and immigrants can't pass. They can't go from the eastern United States to the western United States anymore.
So this was a show of force, really, on Brigham Young's part to basically say, I'm letting the natives loose. If the troops try to come through, they're going to be on our side.
Yeah, and immigrants can't come through.
Right.
So if you think about immigration at the time, and again, let's go back to that map. Let's see. So as I was mentioning, you can see the eastern United States. You had to get to the west. This is before the railroads, before other modes of transportation. You had to go along these trails. And Utah Territory at the time was this huge, vast territory. So all these trails passed through Utah Territory. And it was so important to the United States, which was expansionist, manifest destiny. We've all heard that expression. The Eastern U.S. and the federal government really wanted white civilization to spread across the entire continent. But for that to happen, people had to pass through Utah Territory. So that's Young's leverage point. He says, okay, immigration must stop if you send the troops here. If you pull the troops back, we can go back to normal. Immigration can continue. Everything's fine. So he's just trying to say that the troops are going to cause war to break out, and Native Americans are going to raid cattle. No more immigration can take place anymore. It's not safe. So it's a bluff. And he's saying this in public speeches. He's writing this back to Washington, to his superiors. He's talking to journalists and say, hey, print this in your papers. No more immigration. Kind of like today, like there's a lot of embargoes, or, people aren't shopping at certain
trade wars and
protests. This is kind of the same thing if we want to think about it and compare to what's going on today.
Yeah.
They're just like, we're embargoing immigration. We're going to say immigration can't happen anymore.
Yeah.
So publicly he's saying that, but then privately he's secretly talking to Native Americans to make sure that these raids actually take place. And then Mormon missionaries to the Indians who speak their languages, they end up participating in these raids that take place.
Yeah.
So,
so can we go back to the other map where it shows, the different raids that were happening?
Yes, there we go. So basically to my knowledge, every wagon company that was passing through, that was in the territory in September through October, is attacked. Every single one of them.
Okay.
I should be careful because there might be some that we don't know of, that didn't get attacked, but you can see all of these various wagon trains are attacked.
But that was their goal, they knew the location of all of these wagon trains that were coming through, and their goal was to attack every single one of them so that the message would get out that Brigham Young had let the Native Americans do as they please, and here people were suffering and their cattle was being stolen.
Exactly. And so again, that's playing on racialized 19th century stereotypes of Indians as savages. I don't subscribe to that. That's just the mindset at the time.
Right.
And so he's trying to scare white people who want to pass from the east to the west. No, you can't do it anymore. It's not safe anymore because the troops are coming.
Yeah.
So that's his strategy.
Right.
So what happens at the Mountain Meadows is the initial attack takes place. John D. Lee, who was living in southern Utah at the time in a place called Harmony, Utah. He is an Indian agent to the local Indians, teaching them farming. He gathers a group and he goes out to the Mountain Meadows on September 6th, 1857, which happens to be his 45th birthday, coincidentally. But he heads out, and then in the early morning hours, they're meant to just run off the cattle, but Lee says he trips on a herdsman who was protecting the cattle, wakes him up, Lee goes to shoot him in the head, but his flintlock cat pistol misfires and it doesn't go off. So the herdsman starts running towards the company at the Mountain Meadows where they're all encamped. He wakes everybody up. The immigrants pick up their guns and start firing back, and a small battle ensues for about 30 minutes. And in that small battle, several immigrants are murdered and killed.
Okay, so I just want to make sure that we really set the stage here. So John D. Lee is trying to just run off the cattle. And he probably doesn't expect that there's going to be any people. He probably sees the cattle there and thinks he's just going to scare them away. But he doesn't expect to see a herdsman protecting or any people nearby.
Yeah. So John D. Lee says, this is in the middle of the night or, early morning hours, pre-dawn morning hours. John D. Lee says he trips on a herdsman. He stumbles over him and wakes him up. So yeah, it's dark. And he's climbing up on a knoll, he says, to maybe kind of overlook. Who knows? He doesn't go into that detail, but he's creeping up on a knoll and stumbles over this herdsman and wakes him up.
It's weird to me that he says that he was going to shoot him in the head and his armament didn't fire.
Yeah.
Well, this is
when he's already been caught, and he's going
to could be a story that he's feeding.
And so as the attorneys before his first trial, no, he's being honest about this part. But they're saying if you confess to everything and then tell us everything you know about Mountain Meadows, then and if it's satisfactory to us, we'll let you turn state's evidence and you're off the hook. So John D. Lee writes this, what he calls a confession, and he shares all this information as being very forthcoming. For a lot of it, not for all of it. And that's why he's even like confessing what he did, because he hopes that the prosecution's going to accept his testimony and say, okay, we'll make you a state's witness and you're off the hook. You're well aware, Megan, of your study of the Chad Daybell trial, for example, all of the state's witnesses, all of the people that could have been prosecuted, but they chose to testify instead. That's what John D. Lee was hoping for. And they get his confession, and he doesn't point in there to say that Brigham Young ordered it. And because of that, the prosecutors say, this isn't satisfactory to us. Instead, we're going to use your confession to prosecute you.
Wow. So they were really wanting him to name Brigham Young, or at least name whoever his superior was that ordered the attack.
Yeah. And Lee does name those superiors. He names Isaac Haight, who was the state president at Cedar City. We're jumping ahead a little bit, but yeah, he does name the superiors, but he just says it's a local thing, the massacre itself. And so
he doesn't want to impugn the prophet.
Yeah, he does.
And he was sealed to the prophet, right? Or adopted.
Yeah. So, so backing up, the law of adoption was a doctrine that the Latter-day Saints used to believe in the 1840s. It kind of fell out of their beliefs, so that if you ask 99.9% of Latter-day Saints today, they'll have no idea what the law of adoption is. But law of adoption is you could adopt your friends to you. So you could be, married, you could be sealed in the temple to your spouse or spouses in the case of polygamy, or your children who, if you're new converts in the church, you could be sealed to your biological children or children that you adopt, for example. So that is still part of LDS practice today. But back in the 1840s, you could also have your friends sealed to you as your children, through a law of adoption. It was just like expanding these eternal family networks in the next life.
Yeah. And so for my listeners, just to very quickly say that sealing was just a way of putting divine authority on your relationships so that you would make sure that you would be with those people after this life is over.
Exactly. So Brigham Young had 50 men who were friends of his sealed to him through the law of adoption, but they weren't, and John D. Lee was one of them. So John D. Lee was only 11 years younger than Brigham Young. he was an adult when he was, adopted to Brigham Young, sealed to Brigham Young as an adopted son. So that's misunderstood quite a bit. People think that Brigham Young raised John D. Lee, but that's
Right.
not at all.
It's like a dynastic thing to do to expand your power and network.
Expand your family.
Yeah.
Expand your family in the next life. Yeah.
Even so, I think it does inform a little bit and give maybe another reason why John D. Lee wouldn't have wanted to implicate Brigham Young, because he's the prophet of the church. He speaks for God in the minds of all the Mormon people. And for John D. Lee, he's sealed to the prophet, which gives him some clout and power, right? And doesn't want to damage their relationship or risk any kind of retribution from Brigham Young.
Absolutely. So, he loved Brigham Young.
Yeah.
Early, till he's convicted, till Lee's convicted, and Young doesn't step up to save Lee. And then after that, Lee hates Brigham Young. He despises him by the time he is excommunicated.
Yeah. So to go back to this scene where John D. Lee believes that all he's doing is running off the cattle, but he already has in his mind, he must have already had violence in his mind, because his first instinct when he trips over this cattleman is to shoot him in the head.
Yeah. Lee was a violent man, and we show that in Massacre of Mountain Meadows and also in Vengeance's Mind. He had a history of violence. He, as a polygamist, was sealed to 19 wives throughout his life. Many of them left him. And we have the notes, and we share it in our books, the church courts, where a lot of his wives accused him of physically abusing him, and it's pretty brutal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
his first instinct when tripping on this herdsman, rather than just letting him go and saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I tripped over you. I'm traveling through," or making up some other excuse, his first instinct is to shoot him in the head.
Yeah, to keep him quiet.
Yeah. So the herdsman runs off, and he goes to the rest of the wagon train, which is encamped a little ways away.
Yeah, just below the hole.
Right. And so this herdsman then tells everybody, "There's a white man out there. He tried to kill me. He was running off the cattle." Or please, you continue, because you know the story.
He's not able to tell everybody because Lee's chasing him and firing on him.
Okay.
And Lee says he killed as he's diving into a tent. He shoots him as he's diving into a tent. And so that wakes up the dogs, wakes up the emigrants, and everybody runs for their guns. And there's it goes on for about 30 minutes. This is on Monday, September 7th, 1857. And so the emigrants quickly circle their wagons, and John D. Lee's like, "Oh, whoops, this didn't go as planned." So he sends 2 militiamen that are with him at this event from Cedar City. He sends them back to Cedar City to report to Isaac Haight, who is the militia major, the mayor, and the state president, the LDS state president of Cedar City. So again, here you have another example of no separation of powers.
Yeah.
Again, a lesson we can learn from these things is what happens when one individual amasses too much power. It gets dangerous.
Right.
Yeah. No checks and balances, and it's scary what can happen.
Yeah, for sure.
So, so they're writing back to tell Isaac Haight that this didn't go as planned. They didn't just run off the cattle, and now immigrants have been killed, and they've encircled their wagons and dug in. What should we do? So as they're writing back to Cedar City, I wonder if it shows it in the map.
Do you have a picture of Haight by any chance?
I do. Let's see. Yes, here is Isaac Haight.
Okay.
So you can see Isaac Haight is more of a dandy. He really liked nice things, and he liked dressing nice, and he liked having nice houses.
Yeah. So he's the stake president and the mayor of Cedar City.
That's right.
Okay.
Okay. So let's see. Yeah, no, I don't have. Oh, I do. Okay. So looking at this map here, you can see where it says number 5, marking the 5th attack at Mountain Meadows, that star. If you go north out of the Mountain Meadows, northeast, you would get to Cedar City. And on this, it was called Leach's Cutoff. As these 2 militiamen are riding back to Cedar City in Leach's Cutoff, they encountered 2 immigrant men who were part of the party. And these two men were behind the rest of the immigrant party, rounding up stray cattle to kind of bring in with the main herd. So they are completely unaware on Monday that their company has just come under attack at the Mountain Meadows.
Okay.
And so again, they turn to violence. So these militiamen think, oh, we need to contain the situation. These immigrant men are outside the corral. They're not contained within there. So we need to kill them. So a man named Bill Stewart and Joel White are the two militiamen. They fire on these two immigrant men. One of them was named William Aiden. We know his name. They shot and killed William Aiden. And but Aiden's companion gets away and starts riding towards his company at the Mountain Meadows. The militiamen follow him, and they see that he gets inside the wagon corral where the other immigrants are. So now what do you have inside that corral?
Witnesses.
Yeah.
Witnesses that can tell the tale that these are white men, not natives.
Exactly. They can tell the tale that white men are involved in running off these cattle raids. It's not just Native Americans. And then again, in this mindset of war hysteria in 1857, the leaders make the horrible decision. They think, okay, we need to wipe out all these witnesses because, and again, we have it in their words, but they say, if we allow these people to go on to California knowing that we're involved in these, and some of their number have been murdered now. There's already an army coming on us from the Northeast. Now there will be an army coming on us from California, and we're just hemmed in, and it's just going to get worse. And so they make the horrible decision that they need to wipe out all the witnesses except the young children, quote, too young to tell tales, and we're going to wipe everybody else out.
So they're making the assumption, or is this actually the case, that if this train makes it to California, those are their friends and relatives there who are going to want to avenge the deaths of the people who are coming from Arkansas?
Just Americans in general. I mean, the Mormons were hated. They were hated and despised at this time. So again, to understand where they're coming from, not that it justifies it, but their mindset is they're afraid. They're acting under fear because of what they've been through before. And they're thinking it's just a repeat. This is going to happen again. It's going to happen again. And we've got nowhere else to go. Where are we going to go now if we get driven out again?
Yeah.
So
and that again, that mindset makes sense. Thinking that they and their ancestors have come from this situation where they were driven from their homes and their leader was killed by a mob. And so now the American government, like you say, is coming from the Northeast. If they're going to be attacked then from California with people avenging these deaths, then they're going to be attacked and beset on all sides, and they'll never have peace. And again, like Jean pointed out, they're working with righteous indignation here, that they're God's chosen people, and that the whatever means justify the ends, because they're preparing for Christ. And also the directions for this atmosphere have come from the prophet of God, not from the governor of the state, not from the Indian Affairs appointee.
Thinking of him as the prophet or the president of the church. Absolutely. Yeah. So they make that horrible decision. When that first attack occurs on Monday, so those two men, they kill Aiden and attempt to kill his companion. Then they make it on to Cedar City, and they report to Isaac Haight what has happened. So going back to Haight's picture again. So they report to Haight what has happened. Haight calls a council meeting, and they meet and decide what they need to do. And Haight is saying, well, we need to wipe these people out. And then some on the council say, no, let's send a letter to Brigham Young first and see what he advises. So Haight sends an express rider north to Salt Lake City, just saying, the Indians, quote, have these immigrants corralled at Mountain Meadows. What should we do? And then Young sends a letter back. The express rider arrives in Young's office on September 10th, and Young says a letter back saying the Indians will do as they please. So using that language he's been using over and over and over. That's The Indians will do as they please, but you must not meddle with them. If those who are, he says, we must try to preserve good feelings with them. Again, this is part of his PR approach of trying to win public opinion for the Latter-day Saints, against the federal government sending troops to occupy their cities.
Yeah. So
So
again, a
we must
different
preserve-
narrative in public than
Right.
what he's saying privately.
Right. So he says, we must try and preserve good feelings with them. If those who are there will go, let them go in peace. Well, that letter arrives on September 13th, 1857, after the massacre took place. So one of my big questions I always had was, why on earth didn't they just wait to hear back from Brigham Young?
Mm-hmm.
They bothered to send an express rider to him.
Right.
Why didn't they wait to hear back from him? And the answer, again, it comes up in the sources, but they know that there's this company. If you look at number 4, it's a combined Turner Dukes Collins company that's already come under attack twice. They know this company by now it's at Parowan, just north of Cedar City. They know that the company is about to pass through Mountain Meadows very soon. And so their thinking is if they come through and they see what's going on, then you've got a whole other wagon train who also now knows what's going on.
Right.
So they think we just got to take care of this now. And then what they say is we're going to blame the whole thing on the Indians and say that this was an Indian massacre and not confess or admit that white men were involved in it. So, and then they lied to Brigham Young about it as well. So when Brigham Young's letter arrives saying, let them go, Haight says, oh, wow, we're in a muddle. And so then the leaders of the massacre start covering it up, not only to outsiders, but also to their own leaders.
Yeah. So this is probably where we get a lot of these rumors that we have heard in the past about this wagon train was part of the group that killed Joseph Smith. There was another prominent Mormon leader who had been killed, and his name was Parley P. Pratt. Mm-hmm. And the rumor was that the gun that killed Parley P. Pratt was being carried by one of these immigrants. So this is where the Mormon rumor mill sort of picked up some of these ideas that it was trying to make it seem more justified, I think.
And it's important to point out who's spreading these rumors: the perpetrators.
Of course.
The leaders of the crime. So they're the ones, we have the record of what John D. Lee told Brigham Young on September 29th, 1857, when he rides up to report the massacre to Young. And I'm putting it like this because he just tells him complete falsehoods. And we know what he was saying because Wilford Woodruff, who was a church historian, was in the office at the time writing down that day what Lee said. And Lee said, well, these people said they were in the mob in Missouri and Illinois. They weren't. They're from Arkansas. They weren't. Mm-hmm. But he lies to Young and says they were part of the mob, and that they were bragging that Joseph Smith should have been killed a lot sooner than he was. There had been what we figured out was an anthrax outbreak, which had led to some in the summer of 57, that had led to some Latter-day Saints and some Indians near Fillmore to die after eating cattle and harvesting cattle where the immigrant company passed through. So they don't understand what anthrax is, of course, at the time. So they think it's poisoning. So Lee passes through. He hears that there's this poisoning. So he tells Brigham Young that these people had poisoned springs. He tells them that they were, quote, rotten with the pox, which means venereal disease. He's sharing all these lies. And we kind of trace in our book, In Vengeance's Mine, you can see how these lies started by the perpetrators of the crime. They eventually spread until all of the Mormon people believed these horrible things, including Brigham Young, for generations.
Right.
And I mean, that literally, our book, one of our goals was to debunk all of these falsehoods, all these horrible things about these victims, to end the victim blaming, to debunk all that and say, no, these people weren't guilty of any of that. They were innocent people that were at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. So I think it's important to say, once they make the horrible decision to wipe out this wagon train, can you go take us through exactly what happened?
Yes. So they make this decision that they've got to kill all the witnesses. Isaac Haight rides up to Parowan. Let's go back to this map again. He rides up to Parowan. Are you seeing that full screen, or does it matter? Anyways, he rides from Cedar City up to Parowan, where the commander of the Iron County Militia District, William Dame, lives. And he has to get permission from Dame to call out the militia to participate in this. He goes, Dame meets with his council first in Parowan. The council says, let them go, help these immigrants, gather up their cattle for them, help them on their way, and help them to go. Haight pulls Dame aside after that decision is made in council and says, you don't understand. There have been white men involved, and we've murdered some of the immigrants, and they know it. And so he says, we can't let them go. And so Dame privately gives permission to Haight to call out the militia. So that's why Dame and Haight share in this response.
Okay.
So Haight goes back to Cedar City. He calls out approximately from Cedar City, there were 30 something from Cedar City. And then there are militiamen that come up from Washington, the little settlement of Washington as well.
Washington, Utah.
Yep. And I, incidentally, years into this project, discovered I had an ancestor that was in that group. Anyways, all told, there are 50 to 60 Mormon militiamen who go out to the Mountain Meadows. And a lot of these men said that they didn't know why they were going, that Haight told them they were going to save the immigrants from the Indians. I didn't believe that at first, but the more I studied it, I thought, they may be telling the truth, because if Haight's going to get people, send people out there, if he says to them, hey, I'm sending you out to the Mountain Meadows so you can massacre a lot of women and children, I don't know how many would have gone.
Yeah, I agree with that.
But if he says, I'm sending you out there to save these immigrants who are under attack, then they'd be more likely, okay, yeah, grab my gun and go. Who knows? That's what they said.
Yeah.
They get to the Mountain Meadows, and there they are told by another leader named John M. Higbee, who, again, is Isaac Haight's counselor in the state presidency and a militia major and the sheriff of Cedar City. No separation of powers.
Right.
John M. Higbee informs all of these militiamen what they're about to do. And then they are just forced to line up and just go right outside the corral. John D. Lee goes inside the corral. He wins the immigrants' trust enough to let him inside, and he tells them, we're here to rescue you. You've killed some Indians, and so they're mad at you. They're mad at the men. They're not mad at the women and children. They're just mad at the men. So what we're going to do is we're going to have the women and children walk out first, and they're going to walk back to the settlements where we'll help you. And then the men, we're going to require you to put all of your guns in the back of one of our wagons, one Mormon wagon. And then you're going to walk alongside of us. We're going to escort you out of the valley safely, because the Indians are mad at you, not them.
Okay. So yeah, that's what I wanted to make sure to point out, is the reason they were surrendering their weapons was so that the Indians could see that they were being escorted out unarmed.
Unarmed, yes. And the Mormons have, these friendships, these relationships with the local Native Americans. So, and Lee's lying, of course.
Of course.
He's described as silver-tongued. So he's trying to talk them into do this. We know that there's a debate that breaks out within the wagon train with the leaders. Some say, no, you're a fool if you trust him. You can't trust him. And another says, look, he's here promising us peace. And really, they were desperate. This seemed like their best option, the immigrants, because they've been there for 5 days in the heat of the September sun in the desert. It was so hot. They're just out of reach of the water. They're encircled outside of the spring. They can't get to the springs for water. They're also out of ammunition. And I think they just couldn't believe, in that 19th century viewpoint, they couldn't believe that a group of white men wouldn't save them from the Indians. It was the Indians who were supposed to be savages, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
That's
anyways,
important.
there's debate. They're like, they don't know what to do, but in the end, they're just desperate and they decide, okay,
Yeah.
we're gonna have to trust you. So they lead the women and children out first. And when they get to that ridge that I kind of had you point to, an interpreter named Nephi Johnson was there with local Indians. Nephi Johnson spoke Paiute. He was fluent because he was a missionary to the Paiute. He's horrified at what he's told to do. But anyways, at a signal, the militiamen turn and shoot the immigrant men to their left, and Nephi Johnson unleashes the Native Americans who were hiding up there in that ridge to murder the women and children. And it's a horrific scene, and we go into it in detail. And the reason why I wanted to go into it in detail is I never wanted to hear someone ever say again, those people deserved it. I need to know how horrific it was. No one deserved this. So
yeah. So we probably won't go into graphic detail here, but just to note that it was about 100 immigrants who were killed, including women and children.
Mostly women and children.
Yeah. And they did try to separate out some children who were younger than 7. Is that correct? But we do know that some children younger than 7, including infants, were killed as their mothers were holding them.
Yeah.
Well, and I'd like to say right here that the signal was do your duty to God.
Actually, it wasn't.
Okay.
That's a myth that's passed down through the generations that we debunk. The signal was actually halt. Yeah.
So when the militiamen told the men to halt, that was when they were to fire on the men.
Shoot. And that's when Nephi Johnson said go.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a myth.
Another myth.
Yeah. Do your duty. Because it sounds like more ominous, black-hatted,
Yes. And well, not only that, but it's sort of to a lot of Mormons where the means justify the ends, to say, if this was your duty to God, if this is what you had to do to protect your faith and to defend your people, and it follows that narrative.
Yeah, they definitely saw it as something that was their duty that they had to do. But just the historical record shows that the signal was halt. But I will say that, so before they do this, and they John M. Higby brings word from Cedar City, and he says, this is what we have to do. We're going to wipe all these people out. And there's resistance at first from some of the leaders. They're like, how can we participate in this? And they end up saying, well, if we let them go, they're going to come back here. They're going to kill our women and children. So it might as well be their women and children instead of ours. Again, using violence to solve a problem. So they see it as like, oh, we have to do this to protect ourselves.
They see it as justifiable homicide. And this is a running theme in Mormonism that I just want to continue to always point out.
Yes.
On page 6 of the Book of Mormon, Nephi, the prophet, is commanded by an angel to kill the bad guy, Laban, because Laban has their religious record. And so they're saying, you're justified in killing this man because otherwise we won't have our religious record.
Yeah, exactly. That's their thinking at the Mountain Meadows, is we have to kill these people to save ourselves.
Yeah.
We have to do.
So before we move on to comparing the actual tragedy with the fiction of American Primeval, I just want to put in another plug to please buy this book. It is incredibly well researched, well documented. There are pictures and maps, references to the actual source documents and the historical records. If you care about history, and you should, and if you care about the real history, and you should, this is the book. Again, it's Vengeance is Mine, The Mountain Meadows Massacre and Its Aftermath, available anywhere books are sold. And it's Barbara Jones Brown co-authoring with Richard E. Turley Jr.
Thank you. And we were talking earlier about your reading it, Megan. It can be a tough read.
Yeah, I've had to take some breaks for sure.
Don't read it late at night. But it's also just an important important read. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, the truth matters. And I was really touched to read your inscription in here. I didn't read it until I was actually home from Utah. But Barbara signed my book, and she wrote to Megan, my fellow truth teller, the truth matters. That's all.
That's right. Yeah, no, I've thought so much about you and others like Lauren Matthias and just all of you who are out there talking about these more recent crimes committed by Mormons, Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, Ruby Franke, Jody Hildebrandt, Tim Ballard. And I see so many, I'm like, oh, I recognize some things in them and in their crimes that reverberate from Mountain Meadows. Yeah. So it's important to tell the truth.
Yeah. Yeah. So Jean has seen American Primeval. You've seen it. I have not seen it, mainly because people told me, don't waste your time because it's not even, it's bloody and violent and it's not even accurate.
Yeah. It's fine. I mean, of course, a producer has a right to do anything they want. They can be producers all the time or inspired by a story and then tell a completely different story. So
based on an event.
Yeah. Well, it's not even like, to be honest, I didn't even feel like it was based on, I felt like, okay, I guess you could say inspired by the Utah War, but it's inspired by the Utah War, but the events and the characters in it are not
highly fictionalized,
close to being actual. So my concern about it is most people or a lot of people who are watching it think it is history. They think it is a docudrama, but it's not even close to being similar. And so, and then I've listened to the producer talk about it sometimes, and he talks about it as if it's factual. So that's my concern. But I mean, if people want to watch an entertaining thing, it's fine. But it's also like, I also find that it's very racist in that it's perpetuating these tropes of the West that Native Americans are savages that we've been talking about, that, Latter-day Saints were playing on that, and they will kidnap and rape white women and slit white women's throats. And I was very troubled by that because none of that happened in this story.
Right.
It sprinkles in a little bit of goodness of the Native Americans, like the one character is treated well by that one tribe.
Well, she's kidnapped and they're treated.
No. I mean, the guide had a very deep relationship with that one tribe that maybe raised him or something like that.
Oh, you're talking about Jim Bridger has a friendship?
No. The character that was leading that woman from Boston.
Oh yeah. He had grown up as in the Shoshone tribe. This fictional character. Yeah. So it's not all negative or anything like that, but just, I was very disturbed by the violence that the Native Americans carry out was just not, the Paiute and Shoshone never did these things.
And maybe that's what some of my viewers were talking about when I said that they downplayed the violence. They downplayed the violence of the actual massacre, but then they increased the violence that was happening. Yes, exactly. Made up violence.
Exactly. So it is very, very, very violent series, and the violence that they have in there is made up. So my thing was like, why not have the real violence, tell the real story, which is actually, if you want violence, it's far worse and far more sinister, what I just described to you.
Right. So American Primeval is it a series and there are several episodes?
Yes, it's a Netflix series and there's 6 episodes. And again, people have found it very entertaining. I just want people to know it's 95% fiction. That's all.
Yeah. Watching. So do they portray Mountain Meadows in the first episode?
They did. And this is how far off it is from the actual thing. Was I knew that Mountain Meadows Massacre was going to be portrayed in the first episode. So I was really excited about the series. I thought it was going to be awesome. I thought it was going to be closer to reality because I did know they had a copy of our book. And Peter Berg spent the day with my co-author one day down at the Mountain Meadows, and my co-author walked him through everything that happened. So I thought, okay, this is going to finally, do a realistic depiction of Mountain Meadows. And so I was also gearing myself up emotionally, Megan, because I thought, okay, I'm going to end up crying. It's always very, very tough to see depictions of this horrific crime. So I was all geared up for it. And then there was an attack on a wagon company right outside of Fort Bridger up in what is today Wyoming. And, all these women survived, all these people, all these adults survived, and the perpetrators were wearing hoods, which the Mormons weren't wearing hoods at Mountain Meadows. And so, and it happened like during the light of day too. And then it was just over like that. It was over. There was no siege. There wasn't the 5-day. Anyway, so I just thought, oh, okay, this isn't the mountain. I was just watching it and I was like, oh, okay. Okay, this isn't the Mountain Meadows Massacre. This is some other attack. And then
fictionalized.
And I went, oh, I guess that was the depiction of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. But it's interesting because the series doesn't ever even call it Mountain Meadows Massacre. They call it the Meadows Massacre. And when I was listening to Peter Berg on Josh Rogan, he was doing the same thing. He just called it the Meadows Massacre, not the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I don't know why.
That's so sad. I mean, it seems like such a missed opportunity. They had this opportunity to tell this amazing story, of course, a tragic story, but a very compelling part of American history, I think, that really needs to be told. And they had the opportunity to tell it in the right context. And it seems like they just completely missed the mark.
Exactly. Well, and it's a made up, story about what the American West was. Even the American West wasn't portrayed accurately. Again, the way they portrayed Native Americans, and it was like, the opening screen. There's a black screen when they're saying what the series is about, and it says Utah Territory. It's all caps. It says Utah Territory, 1857. Wild and untamed. And it's this old trope, these white gentile army men, they're all really good guys. They come in the West, they're just trying to make the West safe for civilization by white people. They're the good guys, when in fact, and they have this little ragtag band of Mormon militiamen wipe out this entire army contingent, which I was also laughing at that, because I was like, oh, no. If they had come to full battle, this little group of militiamen and the U.S. Army, the Army would have wiped out those Mormons.
Absolutely.
And then they have the Mormons wipe out this group of Shoshone. It's actually in 1863, a different U.S. Army contingent wipes out more than 400 men, women, and children of the Shoshone nation. And it's the Army who does that. All of the massacres of Native Americans that take place in the West are U.S. Army troops. They're not the good guys. They're to make the West safe for civilization, which is that tired story that was revitalized again, I felt like. And I looked at the writers and directors, and they're all from New York City. So I thought, okay, these are Easterners' views of what the West was like. And once again, they got Easterners going wrong.
And the church put out a statement saying that this was a bad show because it was going to rekindle feelings of maybe potential harm for current members. And I was thinking, I've seen, war stories where the Holocaust, and it doesn't make me think that all the Germans are bad, right?
But we all think all the Nazis are bad. Definitely, right? Yeah.
And then at the same time, if the accurate description of Mountain Meadows was portrayed, that would make the Mormons look far, far worse, more cowardly.
Yeah, sure. But at least it was based on,
cutthroat.
I agree, Jean, with you 100%, but at least it was based on fact.
And it would have been based on fact as well, right?
You know what I'm saying? Like, yes, let's condemn the massacre. Let's condemn what happened. Let's condemn those decisions. Let's condemn all of the things that were put into place that it led to this happening.
But it is still shining the light of truth.
Sure. Yeah. But if it's all made up, we're condemning people for things that didn't happen. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, let's condemn people for what actually happened.
Yeah, and I didn't mean shining the light of truth. I mean creating interest for people to go actually discover what the real truth was.
Right.
Absolutely. And that part I love, there have been a lot of people who it has encouraged them, like you, Megan, like getting the book later, and you too, Jean, I'm assuming, but, I want to learn the true story, what happened.
Yeah, I just thought it would be interesting to look at. This is the Salt Lake Tribune's article where they reported on the church coming out and saying, American Primeval, they call the inaccuracies and stereotypes dangerously misleading. Brigham Young, the Utah-based faith, complains is egregiously mischaracterized as a villainous, violent fanatic. What would you say about that characterization, Barbara?
Yeah, so I wanted to know what my friend John Turner thought. John, and the reason why is John Turner, he's not a Mormon. He's a scholar, a professor of history in the East. He wrote a biography of Brigham Young called Brigham Young Pioneer Prophet, if people want to read that. And so I asked John, I said, so what did you know, he knows Brigham Young better than I do. I know him pretty well, Brigham Young, for, this period, but like John Turner really, did a whole biography on him. And he said it was all accurate. And again, it's coming from a non-Mormon. He's not trying to be apologetic or anything. And I said, how did you feel like it was inaccurate? He says, well, Brigham Young's character could have gone toe to toe with the Jim Bridger character with like witty sayings and humor and stuff. He's like, instead, like Brigham Young looked like, he made him look weird, like really. I mean, Brigham Young was weird, polygamy, and, but not that weird. Does that make sense? It's like a different brand of weird, not an accurate weird.
Right.
So John said that. He said the real Brigham Young was more like the Jim Bridger character. And and then like when Brigham Young was like going along, just going like this on people's heads, bless you, bless you, bless you, and he's like, that's not Mormonism.
It's like the Pope.
Yeah. I bless you. I bless you. Yeah. Never would have done that.
Yeah. So just lots of made up stuff. Now, was Brigham Young the most powerful man in Utah Territory? Absolutely.
Yeah.
He was the governor and leader of the church, prophet. So yes, he had a lot of power, and yes, he wielded his power. He just didn't wield it in the way that was depicted in does that make sense?
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Yeah. So I just want to go back and finish kind of looking at the church statements and get a couple of comments from you. Sure. Part of the statement says the church has long acknowledged and condemned this horrific tragedy. It has also taken significant steps to uncover and share the full truth of what happened and to promote healing. What would you respond to that statement? Have they long condemned, long acknowledged, and long condemned?
Depends on how long, what long means, right? Yeah.
Right.
For generations, the church just didn't want to talk about this anymore, right?
Right.
Even Juanita Brooks, who is my hero, who we dedicate our book to her. She, in the 1940s, wrote the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and she was from southern Utah. And her ancestor, her grandfather, Dudley Levitt, was one of its perpetrators. And so when she is working on this, she knows that the church has some documents in its archives that she wants access to. Those documents are interviews with perpetrators and other witnesses at the time. She knows that the church has those. She tries to get those documents from the church. And their first presidency's secretary, his name was Joseph Anderson. He's sitting down with her at a table. She tells the story. And he comes out and he brings the documents and sets them on the table. Again, 1940s. And says, why do you want these? And she says, well, I'm writing a book. And he says, no, not going to give them to you. So I can't even imagine the horror or just how horrific that would feel as a historian to know that they're right there. And then you can't have them. So juxtaposition, when we were working on Massacre at Mountain Meadows, we got those documents and we used all of them. And a lot of what I'm sharing comes from those interviews, for example, and we cite those. So that just shows the difference. So has the church long acknowledged it? It depends on what you mean by long. I think in more recent decades, definitely the church has come out more strongly to say that. But also, we also quote John Taylor in the book and Brigham Young. So John Taylor was the third president of the LDS Church. We quote them condemning the massacre back in the 19th century. So it depends on how you define the church has long condemned. So yeah, these early leaders condemning it.
But back then, John Taylor condemning it, though, back then weren't they still promulgating the lie that it was largely natives who had undertaken this?
Yeah, exactly. They're not being fully forthcoming. I think at that point they're still thinking it's mostly Native Americans with a handful of white men, and their knowledge of how many Mormons were involved grows over time. But anyway, so I think maybe that's why they said has long condemned it. Because yeah, those early church leaders were, but then there was a period of like, no, we're not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's just been in the last 25 years that the church has come out and said, yeah, we're going to talk about it and condemn it more than ever before. And it talks about can you go back to that statement, Megan?
Yeah. So let me share it again.
Yes. So our research for Massacre at Mountain Meadows, that was funded. And I mean, that was employees in the church history department, historians there. They were scouring the country. They had the funding to go to every archive they could find in the nation. They went to 31 archives archives in 31 of the 50 states to find information. They went through all of the LDS Church history archives, compiled all this information, put together a chronology. So there were numerous people working full time on this project to get the truth out. So I think that's what they mean by taking steps to uncover it, is supporting these two books coming out. I will say though that we wrote them independently. We did not, my co-author and I did not send anything to Correlation or even to any, church leader, first. We sent it to fellow historians for peer review and to descendants of victims and so forth. But anyway, so I think that's what they mean. And then the church has spent millions of dollars purchasing from ranchers who currently owned land in the Mountain Meadows in modern times, purchasing land and then adding and then seeking National Historic Landmark status for the entire meadows, and then adding that land to the landmark status so that all of that land is protected. And the church has spent literally millions of dollars to do that. So I think these are efforts to try and make things right as much as we can today.
So some of that at least accurate, and that's really good to know. All right, I want to go back and just finish the last few comments from this statement. Okay, so it says, so they do quote John Turner. You get this hypocritical sanctimony coupled with ruthlessness, he said in a interview. The trope of religious hypocrisy is really attractive to viewers. In reality, he was just a much more complex figure.
Yeah. And I would agree with that. Like all of the people in this Utah War story are complex.
Okay. It does such graphic and sensationalized storytelling not only obscures reality and hinders genuine understanding, the church warns, but can foster animosity, hate, and even violence. And then the church's statement finishes with a quote from President Nelson, just asking people to be peacemakers.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement against Latter-day Saints. And I have a lot of Native American friends from various tribes, and they've all shared with me too. They couldn't stand this. They were really upset by the depiction of them in it as well. So it's not just white Latter-day Saint settlers that were negatively portrayed.
We were just saying the one thing that makes American Primeval more violent looking is they have slaughtered animals like hanging upside down and letting blood and getting ready to butcher them and stuff that. And so,
well, I don't know. I don't know if we want to just do, was there anything else you wanted to add, Barbara, or do you want to just do a closing statement or?
Sure, I'll do a closing statement.
Sure. So just final thoughts on Mountain Meadows, American Primeval.
So inasmuch as American Primeval has encouraged people to wait, what? The Mormons were at war with the federal government in 1857, 58. I want to learn more about that. That's fantastic. And I have had, it's generated new interest again in the Utah War and the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So I love that. As long as it just, prompts people to go and learn the real story, and people understand that American Primeval is just highly fictionalized.
Yeah.
So as long as they're, they understand that, I think it's fantastic, and just go learn the real story. But I just would encourage people not to think it's a docudrama and that it's close to being accurate, because it's not. It's just pure fiction.
Yeah. So it's a good place to start. But for the real story, again, go and buy the book, Vengeance is Mine.
Or check it out at your local library, or go online and Google stuff. But please engage with the actual
And you mentioned it was part of a series. How many books were in the series?
So Vengeance is Mine, the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its Aftermath, is the second in a two-part series.
Okay, two
First
parts.
book, which I edited, was called Massacre at Mountain Meadows, and that goes into more of the detail leading up to the massacre. But we wrote Vengeance is Mine, part 2, so that readers don't have to read the first one to come up to speed. So we, through flashback and summary, we bring readers up to speed really with the story, and then you can go on and learn so much more about the aftermath about the massacre too, which is super fascinating, and you kind of move past the violence.
And does it end at John D. Lee's execution?
So almost at the end, it talks about John D. Lee's execution. That's a really dramatic scene. They bring him all the way back to the Mountain Meadows to execute him at the scene of his crime, which was a really unusual thing. I don't know if that had ever been done before, or maybe even since, to be honest.
Probably not.
And then Brigham Young dies a few years later. So that's in 1877. But then we also follow the rest of the lives of the perpetrators and the surviving children as much as we can. And also the Paiute people, the impact that the massacre has had on the local Paiute people for generations. So that goes all the way through, 1880s, 1890s. And then we close with a very dramatic scene of a 19-year-old Juanita Brooks meeting Nephi Johnson, who was the interpreter, I told you about. Nephi Johnson was Juanita Brooks's patriarch. It's an LDS term in which he gave her what's called a patriarchal blessing. And he is on his deathbed and he calls for her because he wants to tell her his story. But he's delirious. And she says to a ranch hand at Nephi Johnson's ranch, she says, "What's wrong with Brother Johnson? He acts like he's haunted." And the ranch hand says, "Maybe he is. He was at the Mountain Meadows Massacre, She writes, "I didn't know. I had only been told it was just Indians." And she's shocked. And anyways, later she goes on to research and be the first to tell a scholarly telling of the story. So that's where it goes. Yeah.
And she didn't get the story from him, right?
No, she didn't, because he was delirious by the time she goes there. But the thing with Nephi Johnson that's really interesting, he did give several affidavit confessions. So we do have a lot of this information came from his words. He did testify in the second John D. Lee trial. So we do really have his story. So I don't know if he was going to share more with her, or if maybe he had scrupulosity, because he told multiple people over and over again his part in the story. I don't know, but he just wanted to talk to her as well.
Yeah, I think there is this element that happens sometimes where people who carry an enormous amount of guilt want to tell their story over and over to make sure that it gets out there. Number one, that as many people know as possible, but also, there is an unburdening in the telling of a story like that.
Somehow they're trying to hope to assuage their guilt, because Nephi Johnson, he testified in the trial, and he goes and he hides and changes his name. He goes to Mexico for a while out of fear that he will be prosecuted for his role in the crime. So he's never punished for it. So maybe it's just to assuage his guilt. He just wants to tell it over and over again.
Yeah.
I have an idea for a podcast, Remembering Juanita Brooks. Would you like to be in on that?
Oh, heavens. Yes. She's my shero. I love Juanita. I've become good friends with her granddaughter, who is very much like Juanita. And
that's right. She was one of the people at the Thrive event at the Mountain Meadows.
Yeah, she helped do the tour
guide.
She was a tour guide there. And then afterwards, for those who wanted to go, we all went to Juanita Brooks's house after. And but I'm in talks with her about republishing some of her grandmother's books that are out of print. Not the one on Mountain Meadows. That'll always be in print, of course, but some other books. So I've been working with her on that project.
And I'm curious, do you have a sense of how much of the complete story Juanita Brooks was able to tell? And did she get 50% out or 75%, or what would you say?
In terms of sources, again, Juanita Brooks was one person in the 1940s living in southern Utah. She would ride buses all night to come up to Salt Lake to do a day of research in the archives up here, ride a bus home all night.
Mm.
And so she got a lot, but like a fraction of all of the research that's been done since. So she's my shero in that she had the courage to do it in spite of opposition.
Like she told 90% of the important story.
Yeah, I mean, she gets the story out and publishes it and makes
Right.
it broadly available for the country.
And almost gets excommunicated.
Yeah, well, she says that she writes about her book in a later edition. She writes, my book didn't receive any praise or notice or mention, but it also didn't receive any negative information either. So I'm going to take that for a plus. But she felt ostracized by her community. So no, she was never disciplined by the church.
Soft shunning.
She felt from the community, because it was this unspoken secret. We don't talk about that. When she published it and makes it, publishes it with Stanford University Press, makes it publicly available.
Big splash.
Local people weren't keen on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to show a couple more pictures. This is the memorial that the church erected down, not the one that's up on the hill where we saw before, but this one is down in the valley.
Yes.
And
can I talk about this real quick, Megan?
Yeah, please do.
So this was erected where the initial siege site was. So this is at the campground where the immigrants were camping when they were attacked. And in 1859, a U.S. Army contingent comes in and they bury the bones that are still scattered across the valley in a mass grave. And then they create a like a memorial or monument this is a recreation of it. So it was heavy stone in a canonical like scripture or structure.
Mm-hmm.
The original one, the Army, though, they put a cedar cross rising out of these stones that went up, all told it was like 30 feet in the air. And across the crossbar, the Army men wrote, "Vengeance is mine and I will repay," which is a scripture from the New Testament. That's where we get the title for our book.
Yeah. That's to represent closure, right?
Well, that's to represent, God will take vengeance.
Not anybody else should be doing anything about it, but that.
Well, who knows how they interpreted it, but yeah, you can interpret it. I mean, that's my interpretation. Is God is saying, I will take vengeance. It's not on you. Up to you, it is to forgive. Is what the next verse says in the Old Testament, but.
Yeah, and then I just went around and took a brief video.
Yeah, this is very touching. Just walking around, seeing all those names there. These names are in the ground surrounding that monument we just looked at. And I was just going to say that the church rebuilt that monument in 1998. And so based on but it is over the mass grave of where these bones lie.
Yeah, I just found it touching. That the names were here, and I didn't video all of them because the shadows were on the other side and you couldn't see the names.
And there's like 100.
But there's
88
granddaughter.
88 known names that have been identified. And
so then the remainder, the last 20 or so, are just unknown names.
Yeah, or the last 12.
Yeah.
So what we found, and this is what Juanita Brooks also found in her research, was that the number of 120 comes from this Army contingent that comes in 1859. And they asked Jacob Hamlin, who wasn't at the massacre, but who had a ranch at the Mountain Meadows, how many victims he thought there were. And he had done a superficial burial the year before. And he said, based on just his guess, he says, I think there was about 120. And then unfortunately that becomes the established name that passes through generations, that number. But the earliest accounts we have talking about the body count the day after or 2 days after, they said 95 or 96. And then again, 88 people have been identified. And Juanita Brooks later said the number 120 is grossly exaggerated. There's far more. So again, saying that there's only 100 instead of 120 doesn't make this crime any less horrible. It's still horrific, but it's just important to say, okay, these are what the sources are saying the numbers are.
Right. And then we didn't actually even talk about the children who were younger than 7 who weren't massacred. They were taken to homes of Mormon people, right? Initially to be sort of adopted into these Mormon families.
Yeah.
And then do we know how many children?
There were 17 children, age 6 and under, who were spared. Most of them were babies and toddlers.
And then how long did it take to get them returned to their families?
Yeah, great questions. So initially, right after the massacre, they are farmed out into different Mormon homes. They're separated from each other in hopes that they will forget what they've seen, what they've experienced. And of course, with the babies and toddlers, that's easier. But there's a handful of them that are aged, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It's a very small number that are a little bit older. But they're separated, and newspaper reports start reaching California immediately after the massacre that there were some children who were spared and that they're in the hands of the Indians, which they never were. They're immediately taken into Mormon homes of the perpetrators, I should say. The men who were there at the massacre, they take these kids home to their homes, which is really creepy, like scary. But anyways, so people in Arkansas, they read these articles about what's happened to their family members, and they read that there are some children who are spared. So they write their congressional delegation, and they ask the federal government to help find these young children so they can be brought home. So one of the federal appointees, his name was Jacob Forney, he goes out, he meets with Jacob Hamlin, he asks Jacob Hamlin to help him round up the kids. Jacob Hamlin rounds them all up, and then eventually they are returned by wagon. They go back to Arkansas, and they're reconciled with their families. And this is all covered in detail in Ben Nitz's mind if people want to read about that.
Yeah.
That's a really moving event when those children get home and what their families write about, what they see when those kids come home. It's really emotional, super emotional.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So,
well, Barbara, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and going over this comprehensively. Again, I just feel it's so important to tell the true story, and I'm so grateful for all of the research that you and so many others have done to make sure that this story gets told in its entirety.
Thank you, Megan. That means a lot to me. And it's my mission in life is to make sure that these victims are never forgotten and that people know about the Mountain Meadows Massacre so we can learn from it and do better.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
That's right. It's been great talking with you all. And are we ready to close then?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. So I'll say thanks everyone for watching. Share, like, and subscribe. And have a great rest of 2025.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye.